To be honest, I'm going to get plenty of criticism over my lifetime, and it's something that I don't completely ignore.
The Midnight Summons. The message arrived at Frogmore Cottage at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late September. No caller ID, no warning. Just William's voice, stripped of ceremony, asking his brother to meet him. Not at Kensington Palace with its watching eyes and listening walls. Not at Windsor Castle where every corridor held staff members whose loyalty was to the institution first and the individuals within it second. But at a place only they would know, the old boathouse at Frogmore, where they'd hidden as children during their mother's memorial planning, a refuge that existed in their shared memory as a space untouched by the machinery of monarchy. 7 words that shattered 3 years of silence. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Come alone. Harry stood in the California twilight, phone trembling in his hand, watching the last rays of sun paint the Pacific horizon in shades of amber and gold. The voice on the other end belonged simultaneously to a stranger and to the person who'd known him longest, who'd shared his earliest memories, who understood without explanation what it meant to be a spare in a system designed around primogeniture. The voice was familiar in its cadence, that particular way William had of clipping certain words, a vocal pattern inherited from their father, yet foreign in its sudden re-emergence into his carefully constructed life 6,000 miles from the place that had broken him. He'd imagined this moment countless times during the 3 years of frozen silence, rehearsed responses to hypothetical reconciliations during sleepless nights, played out scenarios where William called, where they met, where bridges were rebuilt or at least the possibility of rebuilding was acknowledged. But he'd never expected it to arrive so starkly, so simply, so utterly without institutional mediation or the elaborate choreography that typically governed every royal interaction down to the minute and the talking point. The palace had no knowledge of this communication. William's private secretary, the gatekeeper of his official life, didn't arrange it. No courtiers orchestrated the logistics or prepared briefing papers or considered the optics. No communication strategy team war-gamed potential media responses. This was beyond protocol, beyond the machinery of monarchy that typically governed every royal interaction with the precision of Swiss watchmaking. These were 2 brothers, circling the wreckage of their relationship, like survivors of a shipwreck, finally ready to examine what could be salvaged from the debris, finally willing to face what they'd become in the years since their spectacular public fracture had entertained and scandalized the world. Harry's arrival in England went undetected by the vast apparatus that usually tracked his every movement with obsessive attention to detail. A private terminal at Farnborough Airport in the dead hours before dawn, when even London's relentless activity paused for breath. A nondescript Range Rover with tinted windows that could have belonged to any wealthy businessman. Driver sourced through back channels that deliberately bypassed official security protocols. His protection team swore to absolute discretion, operating under instructions so sensitive that discovery could end careers and trigger constitutional questions about the monitoring of royal family members. Even Meghan knew only the bare essentials. William had reached out, and Harry was going. Consequences be damned. She'd held him before he left their Montecito home, understanding without need for explanation what it cost him to return to the place that had caused so much pain. Saying nothing because sometimes silence communicated more than any articulated blessing or warning. The British tabloids, usually vulture-sharp in tracking royal movements and proud of their ability to catch the family in unguarded moments, missed it entirely. While they ran breathless stories about the King's autumn schedule and Catherine's latest patronage visit to a children's hospital, while they dissected every facial expression and wardrobe choice for hidden meanings and evidence of family tension, the 5th in line to the throne was moving through London like a ghost, slipping through the city's pre-dawn streets toward a confrontation 4 years in the making. The irony wasn't lost on Harry. He'd spent years complaining about media intrusion, about the impossibility of privacy, about photographers tracking his every movement, and now their obliviousness provided exactly the cover he needed for this most sensitive of missions. William had spent the previous day in meetings, his face the practiced mask of royal duty perfected over decades of public performance and private struggle. But those closest to him, the small circle who'd learned to read the micro-expressions beneath the composed exterior, noticed the tension thrumming beneath like an electrical current, the way his jaw tightened during a housing initiative briefing, the muscle working despite his otherwise relaxed posture, how he checked his watch, his mother's Cartier, worn always as a talisman and reminder, 7 times during lunch with visiting dignitaries, his attention clearly elsewhere despite maintaining perfect conversational engagement, the slight tremor in his hand when signing correspondence, barely perceptible but present to those who knew to look for it, the distraction that manifested as a half-second delay in responses, as if he were operating from somewhere slightly removed from the present moment. Catherine asked if he was well during a rare moment of privacy between official engagements. He kissed her forehead and said nothing, which told her everything she needed to know. They'd been married long enough that silence between them had become its own language, nuanced and precise in ways that words could never achieve. She squeezed his hand and let him go, understanding that some preparations had to be undertaken alone, that some confrontations required solitude before they could be faced. They arrived within minutes of each other just as the September sun began bleeding light across the Thames, turning the water from black to gray to gold in that magical transition between night and day when the world feels poised on the edge of possibility. William got there first, standing on the dock where they'd once fished with their grandfather, where Diana had photographed them laughing and mud splattered and carefree in a summer that felt like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. To 2 boys who'd existed before trauma had reshaped them into the complicated men they'd become. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans, a navy jumper Diana had loved him in, looking deliberately unprincely. Not the Prince of Wales with all its weight and expectation and the crushing awareness of future kingship, just William, as close to simply himself as his position ever allowed. Harry emerged from the tree line as the light strengthened, and for a moment that stretched impossibly long, neither moved. The morning was quiet with that particular quality of silence that exists only in early autumn, when summer's insects have faded and winter's winds haven't yet begun their assault. No photographers lurking in bushes with long lenses, no staff hovering at respectful distances, ready to intervene or assist, no protective buffer of titles and protocols and carefully managed talking points designed to prevent genuine human interaction. Just 2 men who'd once shared everything, a mother, a tragedy, a bond forged in unimaginable loss, separated now by an ocean of hurt too vast for words alone to cross, too deep for simple apology to bridge. The distance between them was 15 feet, but it might as well have been 15 miles, 15 years, 15 lifetimes of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding, and wounds both inflicted and received. William looked older than his 41 years, the weight of future kingship having carved lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during the wedding, during the Jubilee, during all those public moments when they'd stood side by side and pretended everything was fine while the foundation crumbled beneath them. Harry looked weathered differently, the California sun and American independence having reshaped him into someone harder to read, someone who'd chosen freedom over duty and still carried the uncertainty of whether he'd made the right choice etched in the set of his shoulders. William spoke first, his voice carrying across the water with that particular clarity that comes in the stillness before the world fully wakes. Something about thinking, about reconsidering positions held rigidly for too long, about being angry, and then being less angry, and then realizing that anger was exhausting and ultimately empty, that it sustained nothing worth sustaining. Harry stepped closer, the gap narrowing by careful degrees, neither rushing toward reconciliation nor retreating into the safety of distance. And then William said something that changed everything, an admission that must have cost him everything. He acknowledged being trapped, acknowledged that Harry hadn't been entirely wrong in his assessments, acknowledged that the institution demanded sacrifices that perhaps shouldn't be demanded at all from human beings who hadn't chosen their positions but had been born into them. The truth unveiled. William spoke about Catherine's illness with a rawness that transcended his usual careful control, the armor of royal composure cracking to reveal the frightened husband beneath. When she'd been diagnosed, when the world had narrowed to hospital rooms and hushed conversations with oncologists, and the terrible waiting between tests that felt like eternity compressed into days, everything had crystallized with brutal clarity. The absurdity of the machine that kept turning regardless of human suffering, indifferent to the personal catastrophes occurring within it. She was fighting cancer with the courage that had defined her approach to royal life, and he was expected to smile through state banquets, cut ribbons at hospital openings with bitter irony not lost on him, wave from balconies while his world crumbled privately behind the facade of continuity and duty. The machine kept turning with its inexorable momentum, grinding forward with schedules meticulously planned months in advance, protocols that couldn't be disrupted by something as inconvenient as human crisis, expectations that royal duty superseded personal tragedy. William described the suffocating nature of it, the way palace machinery viewed Catherine's cancer as a logistics problem to be managed rather than a human catastrophe being lived, the way his fear was expected to remain invisible, his grief compartmentalized and controlled, his terror at potentially losing her locked away because the institution required strength, not vulnerability, performance, not authenticity. He told Harry about the moment of recognition that had arrived with devastating force during one of Catherine's chemotherapy sessions. Sitting beside her as poison dripped into her veins to kill the cells threatening her life, watching her maintain her characteristic grace even in extremity, he'd realized that protecting the institution meant nothing if it cost him his family. Not just his immediate family, Catherine and the children who'd become the center of his existence, who gave meaning to all the duty and sacrifice, but the brother he'd lost to bitterness and distance and wounds that had festered for years because neither had known how to begin the conversation that was years overdue. The acknowledgement hung between them like morning mist, impossible to grasp but undeniably present, changing the atmosphere even as it remained intangible. William confessed to things he'd never articulated before, not to Catherine, not to his father, certainly not to the courtiers who managed his public life with calculated precision. The media management that felt increasingly insidious, the way every interaction with the press was choreographed and controlled, how genuine human moments were sacrificed for image cultivation, the way courtiers controlled every narrative with surgical precision, shaping public perception through calculated leaks and strategic positioning that left no room for authentic human experience, no space for the messy reality of actual lives lived under impossible scrutiny. He spoke about the impossibility of being human inside a system fundamentally designed to prioritize image over reality, duty over well-being, institutional stability over individual truth or happiness. Every spontaneous gesture was analyzed for its impact on the monarchy's standing. Every personal choice was filtered through the lens of public perception. Every relationship was evaluated for its strategic value to the institution. The system didn't just constrain behavior, it colonized thought itself, making it nearly impossible to separate genuine feeling from trained response, authentic desire from internalized duty. These were the very criticisms Harry had made publicly in interviews that had shocked the world and branded him a traitor in certain circles. And now William was validating them with painful honesty that must have required tremendous courage given his position. But William wasn't surrendering entirely to Harry's worldview or suggesting that Harry's path was the only valid response to institutional pressure. He pushed back on the idea that leaving was the only solution, the only way to preserve one's humanity against the grinding machinery of monarchy. He couldn't run, wouldn't run, because if everyone who saw the problems fled, who remained to fix them from within? Someone had to stay and use the privilege and position to reform, rather than abandon, to work the levers of power toward more humane ends. That wasn't judgment of Harry's choice. William made that clear with deliberate emphasis. It was simply acknowledgement of different paths, responding to the same fundamental problems, different possibilities emerging from different positions, different responsibilities flowing from different places in the succession. Harry had the freedom to leave because he was the spare. William's position as heir made departure impossible, but perhaps made internal reform possible in ways that wouldn't be available to someone outside the system. They walked the perimeter of the boathouse, retracing childhood paths worn smooth by decades of royal feet, their grandfathers, their fathers, their own, when the world was simpler and monarchy felt like dress-up rather than destiny. William spoke about the changes he was planning, structural reforms that would take years to implement quietly, incrementally, working within and against the system simultaneously. Years, because institutional momentum was powerful and resistance to change was embedded in the DNA of organizations centuries old, but fundamental alterations nonetheless in how the monarchy engaged with media, with public life, with the basic humanity of the people inside the machine. Cutting ties with certain outlets, the ones that had destroyed their mother through relentless pursuit and creative cruelty, the ones that had come after Meghan with barely disguised racism and calculated brutality, the ones that pit brothers against each other for clicks and sales, and the perverse entertainment of watching a family tear itself apart publicly. William described his strategy: restructuring media relationships to favor outlets willing to report responsibly, reducing access for those that trafficked in destruction, creating new frameworks for communication that gave the royal family more control over their own narratives without completely abandoning press engagement. The conversation moved to their missing years, the silence that had stretched between them while the world watched and speculated, and created narratives that bore little resemblance to reality. William admitted to thinking about Harry during Catherine's treatment, lying awake at 3 in the morning while she slept fitfully beside him, remembering how Harry had handled Meghan's mental health struggles with a protective fierceness that William had judged at the time but now understood viscerally, recognizing in retrospect his own failure to provide support when it had been desperately needed, when a single conversation or gesture of solidarity might have changed everything. The admission was devastating in its simplicity. Beneath the titles and duties and impossible pressures that had shaped their adult lives, they remained what they'd always been: two boys who'd walked behind their mother's coffin while the world watched, bonded by trauma into a relationship that nothing should have been able to break. The fact that it had broken spectacularly and publicly and seemingly irreparably was a failure that William was now willing to acknowledge and Harry was willing to hear acknowledged. Harry asked why now, why this particular moment after years of frozen silence and missed opportunities. William's answer was characteristically forward-looking, focused on the future rather than the past. He would be king someday, a reality that shaped every decision he made, and when that day came, he refused to be the king who'd lost his brother over pride and stubbornness. He refused to be another generation in a family that ate itself alive for the sake of appearances, another chapter in the long and dismal history of royal estrangement and dysfunction that stretched back centuries. Catherine's silent resolve. Catherine had woken that morning to an empty bed and a note on William's pillow written in his familiar hand: "Meeting Harry. Back by noon. I love you." 5 words that confirmed what she'd known was coming, what she'd encouraged through months of careful suggestion and gentle pressure applied with the strategic patience that had defined her approach to royal life since entering it as an outsider 15 years earlier. She sat in their private sitting room at Adelaide Cottage, the smaller, more manageable residence they'd chosen over the grand apartments available to them, tea growing cold in her hands as she stared at William's handwriting and understood the magnitude of what was happening somewhere beyond her reach. The cottage was quiet in the early morning, children still sleeping, staff not yet arrived to begin the day's routines. Catherine valued these moments of stillness before the machinery started, before the day's demands asserted themselves, before she had to put on the armor of being the Princess of Wales. She'd learned over years of marriage to William that his relationship with Harry was complicated in ways that went beyond typical sibling rivalry or even the particular pressures of being royal brothers. The wound between them was deep and festering, infected by institutional manipulation and media exploitation, and their own inability to communicate across the growing chasm. She'd known this day would come because she'd planted the seeds deliberately, strategically, with the patience of someone who understood that the most important changes happen slowly, almost invisibly, through accumulated small moments rather than dramatic gestures. During her treatment, when the world had narrowed to hospital rooms and quiet conversations and the terrible uncertainty of illness that strips away everything inessential, she'd told William that life was too short for grudges maintained out of pride, too precious for relationships lost to stubbornness and institutional pressure. She'd extracted a promise from him during one of the darker moments when the possibility of her death felt very real and very close. If something happened to her, he would fix things with Harry. William, facing the prospect of losing her and being unable to imagine continuing without her, had promised readily. Catherine, always thinking several moves ahead like the chess player she was, had planted those seeds knowing they might germinate, even if the worst didn't come to pass. The promise, once made, would work on him whether she lived or died. The princess understood what the public rarely saw, and what even close observers often missed, that William's anger at Harry stemmed from pain, not hatred. Brothers who'd survived their mother's demise together, thrust into impossible positions by birth and circumstance, reacting to shared trauma in diametrically opposite ways. William had burrowed deeper into duty after Diana's demise, found meaning in service and structure, built his identity around the role he'd been born to fulfill. Harry had fled it entirely, chosen freedom over obligation, sought meaning outside the confines of institutional expectation. Neither response was wrong in absolute terms, but they were incompatible within the existing framework of royal expectation and institutional demand. She'd watched William carry the weight of multiple roles that often demanded contradictory things, pulling him in different directions simultaneously. Brother to Harry, which required loyalty and understanding and willingness to accept choices he disagreed with. Son to Charles, which required respect for his father's position and support for the king's reign, even when they disagreed on approach. Future king to the nation, which required stability and continuity and subordination of personal preference to institutional need. Husband and father in his immediate family, which required emotional presence and prioritization of their well-being above all else. Each role made legitimate demands, and satisfying one often meant failing another. Catherine's illness had reordered those priorities with brutal clarity, forcing William to confront what truly mattered when faced with potential loss. The possibility of losing her had stripped away the institutional concerns that usually governed his decisions, reduced everything to its essence: family, love, the people who made life worth living regardless of position or duty. That clarity had persisted beyond the immediate crisis, changing his perspective in ways that couldn't be reversed. While William and Harry met at Frogmore, the palace machinery continued its relentless operation, completely unaware that the family's foundational conflict was perhaps beginning to resolve in ways that would reshape the monarchy's future. The king's private secretary reviewed schedules for upcoming state visits with meticulous attention to protocol and precedent. Queen Camilla's team coordinated charity patronages and planned her autumn program of engagements. The communications office drafted statements for various initiatives, managing the careful narrative construction that kept the monarchy relevant and respected in an increasingly skeptical age. This ignorance was intentional on William's part. He'd learned from previous attempts at reconciliation that had been leaked to the press before they'd barely begun, twisted into narratives that served other people's agendas, weaponized by courtiers protecting their own influence and access. Catherine knew the risk of William's unauthorized meeting. If discovered prematurely, if leaked before William controlled the narrative, it could be portrayed as betrayal of his position as Prince of Wales, of his father who had tried and failed to mediate between his sons, of the established order that governed royal behavior with rules accumulated over centuries. The courtiers who'd spent years managing the narrative of William versus Harry, who'd used that conflict to increase their own importance and influence, wouldn't easily surrender that power or accept reconciliation they hadn't orchestrated. But Catherine also understood something the courtiers in their institutional myopia didn't. The future of the monarchy depended less on rigid protocol than on authentic human connection that resonated with modern subjects. A future king estranged from his brother looked weak, not strong, appeared petty rather than principled, small rather than dignified. A family eating itself alive on the world stage didn't inspire confidence or loyalty from subjects who increasingly questioned monarchy's relevance and value. The institution's survival depended on its ability to evolve, to demonstrate that the people within it were capable of growth and change and the basic human decency of family reconciliation. In Montecito, Meghan was awake despite the time difference, phone in hand, watching the sky gradually lighten over the Pacific, waiting for Harry's call that would signal the meeting had ended and he was safe. She'd supported his decision to return to England despite her own complicated feelings about the country that had treated her with such cruelty, understanding what it cost him to revisit the place that had caused so much pain. she had no illusions about the palace, having experienced its capacity for institutional cruelty firsthand, having lived through the calculated destruction of her reputation and the willful refusal to protect her from racist attacks that violated every principle the monarchy claimed to represent. But she recognized that Harry's relationship with William transcended institutional politics and existed in a space beyond the palace's reach, even when the palace tried to control it. These were brothers bound by shared trauma and history that predated their positions, connected by experiences that couldn't be replicated or understood by anyone outside their unique circumstance. That bond deserved a chance at healing, even if the institutions surrounding it remained irredeemably broken in her eyes, even if she could never forgive the harm done to her and to Harry. She thought about Archie and Lilibet, imagining them estranged from their cousins George, Charlotte, and Louis decades hence, unable to bridge whatever divides geography and circumstance might create between them. The thought was unbearable. If this morning's meeting could prevent that outcome, if it could begin healing the fracture between their fathers and give the children a chance at a relationship uncompromised by adult conflicts, it was worth every risk and every painful memory of England's treatment of her family. The palace discovers. By mid-morning, whispers began circulating through palace corridors despite William's careful precautions and deliberate operational security. His protection officers, though sworn to absolute discretion and fully aware that their careers depended on maintaining silence, couldn't entirely mask their unusual movements or explain away the irregularities in the prince's schedule. Observant staff members and the palace employed many whose job was essentially professional observation, noticed things that didn't align with normal patterns. The prince's car leaves Adelaide Cottage at an unconventional hour for an unscheduled destination. His private secretary was deliberately excluded from morning briefings for the first time in years, phone calls being rerouted, schedules being kept vague in ways that suggested intentional obscurity rather than typical flexibility. The accumulated weight of these small irregularities created a pattern that suggested something significant happening beyond official channels, outside the normal machinery of royal management. The king's communications secretary, a woman whose antennae had been finely tuned by 30 years of palace service to detect the subtle frequencies of institutional disruption, sensed something was fundamentally off. Her discreet inquiries hit walls of silence where normally she'd receive immediate cooperation, which told her everything she needed to know. When palace machinery stopped functioning normally, when information flows were interrupted, when people started protecting secrets, something major was happening. By 10 o'clock, the rumor reached Charles himself, delivered by his private secretary using the careful diplomatic language of courtiers who specialized in communicating uncomfortable truths to powerful people without causing offense. The Prince of Wales appeared to be engaged in an unscheduled personal matter of potentially significant nature. Charles, who had spent decades navigating the complex dynamics of his family while managing the demands of his position, understood immediately. William, acting independently, suggested important personal business. Harry, potentially in England undetected, suggested a reconciliation attempt. The math was simple even if the implications were enormous and unpredictable. The institutional response was far less measured than the king's quiet acceptance of his son's independent action. Senior courtiers whose careers depended on managing and controlling royal narratives, whose power derived from being gatekeepers of information and architects of public perception, were genuinely alarmed by the prospect of an unsupervised meeting between the feuding brothers. An unauthorized reconciliation represented a threat to carefully maintained storylines that had taken years to construct and defend. Narratives that served institutional purposes and increased courtier influence even as they damaged family relationships. What if commitments were made that contradicted established positions the palace had spent years defending? What if Harry influenced William toward policy changes the institution opposed, greater press transparency, reduced formality, acknowledgement of past failures? What if the brothers emerged united in ways that diminished courtier influence over the heir to the throne, creating a direct brother-to-brother relationship that bypassed institutional mediation? The questions proliferated in worried conversations, each one representing a potential loss of control that courtiers had worked decades to maintain. An emergency meeting convened in the king's private office within hours of the rumor's confirmation, senior staff gathering with the urgency typically reserved for actual crises rather than family reconciliation. The king's private secretary, William's principal private secretary, notably absent, thus confirming everyone's suspicions and heightening alarm, and the palace communications director gathered to discuss what they euphemistically termed the situation. The tension in the room was palpable, decades of institutional conditioning running up against the uncomfortable reality that the future king was operating beyond their control and might be making decisions that would reshape the monarchy without consulting the people who considered themselves indispensable to its operation. The communications director insisted they needed to know what was being discussed at this unauthorized meeting, needed to prepare responses to potential fallout, needed to maintain some semblance of narrative control in case the meeting went badly or produced outcomes the institution couldn't support. Her alarm was genuine. She'd built her career on managing royal narratives, and unmanaged conversations represented professional failure and potential disaster. Charles disagreed with a steel beneath his measured tone that surprised even his closest advisors, who'd rarely seen the king assert himself so forcefully against institutional pressure. His son was meeting his brother, not negotiating a constitutional crisis or making policy decisions that required government consultation. The family dimension trumped the institutional one. The implication was clear and deliberate. Charles was drawing a line in explicit terms, asserting that some family matters transcended institutional management and existed in a space that courtiers couldn't and shouldn't control. Whatever complaints he harbored about Harry's departure and the damage it had caused to the monarchy's reputation, whatever institutional concerns existed about unauthorized reconciliation and its unpredictable consequences, the king would not interfere with his son's attempt at resolution. It was perhaps the most important thing Charles could do as both king and father: provide cover for William's risk-taking, protection from institutional forces that would otherwise seek to control or undermine the reconciliation attempt. The decision effectively neutered the courtiers' ability to intervene or manage the situation according to their preferred protocols. Without royal backing for their concerns, without the king's authorization to interfere, they could only wait and worry and begin preparing for scenarios they couldn't control or predict. It was a rare moment of Charles prioritizing family over institution, perhaps learning from decades of watching his own family dynamics play out disastrously in public view, perhaps recognizing that some wounds required space beyond institutional reach to heal. At Frogmore, as morning stretched toward noon and shadows shortened under the climbing sun, William and Harry had reached the delicate negotiation of what happens next. The practical implications of their emotional breakthrough. They'd achieved something significant already: honest acknowledgement of their respective positions and the validity of each other's choices, even when those choices were mutually incomprehensible. William would never leave the institution, would never abandon the duty he'd been raised to fulfill. Harry would never return to working royal life, would never resubmit himself to the system that had damaged him so profoundly. These were immutable facts, bedrock realities that no amount of reconciliation or goodwill could change. But perhaps the relationship could exist beyond those constraints, could find space in the margins between duty and freedom, could build something new, rather than attempting to resurrect what had been destroyed. William clarified his request with careful precision. He wasn't asking Harry to return to royal duties or resume the role he'd fled. He was asking if they could rebuild trust without requiring either brother to sacrifice their fundamental choices, to compromise the positions they'd taken at such personal cost. The question was whether reconciliation and divergent paths were compatible, whether love could persist across differences that couldn't be resolved. What that looked like practically involved specific commitments that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. Private conversations were maintained regularly through scheduled calls that worked around time differences and competing obligations. Video calls between cousins who deserved to know each other despite geography and circumstance, who shouldn't be casualties of adult conflict. Selective public appearances at events meaningful to both brothers were united support that didn't require Harry's institutional reintegration. The Diana Award, Invictus Games held in Europe, charitable initiatives they both cared about, moments where they could demonstrate family connection without pretending their positions were the same or requiring Harry to resume royal duties. The aftermath. They parted at noon exactly as William had promised Catherine, no photographers capturing the moment, despite the media's usual omnipresence, no leaked statements following immediately, despite the palace machinery's typical need to control narratives, carrying the weight and possibility of their conversation forward into uncertain futures shaped by choices made that morning beside the Thames. The simplicity of the parting belied its significance. This was the first time in years they'd met privately, talked honestly, and separated without anger or the sense of unbridgeable distance that had characterized their recent relationship. Harry flew back to California that evening on the same private aircraft that had brought him, reversing his ghost-like journey through London, leaving England as quietly as he'd arrived. Meghan was waiting when he came through the door of their Montecito home, children already asleep, the house quiet around them. Her expression asked questions her voice didn't need to articulate. He told her they'd really talked for the first time in years without courtiers or agendas or the pressure of public expectation shaping every word. Not fixed, he was careful about that, didn't want to overstate what had occurred or raise expectations that might lead to disappointment, but not broken beyond repair either, which was more than they'd had 24 hours earlier, more hope than had existed in years. She held him, feeling the exhaustion in his body, understanding that the conversation had cost him emotionally, even as it offered possibilities for the future. They sat together on the couch overlooking the Pacific, and he told her about the boathouse, about William's admissions regarding Catherine's illness, and how it had clarified priorities, about the tentative framework for moving forward. Meghan listened without judgment, setting aside her own complicated feelings about the institution that had harmed her, focusing on what this meant for Harry and for their children's relationship with their cousins. Catherine asked no questions when William returned to Adelaide Cottage shortly after noon. She simply held him in the entrance hall, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders, reading in the set of his body what words couldn't convey about how the meeting had gone. That evening, William played with George, Charlotte, and Louis longer than usual, more present than he'd been in months, his mood noticeably lighter. Catherine watched him from the doorway, vindication of her quiet campaign to push him toward reconciliation, flowing through her with satisfaction and relief. 2 days after the meeting, Charles summoned William for a private audience at Highgrove, the king's personal refuge that had always felt more like home than any palace. They walked the gardens in autumn light, the flowers beginning their retreat into winter dormancy, father and son navigating the complex terrain where family and institution intersected. Charles acknowledged hearing about the meeting with Harry, acknowledged that the palace had eyes everywhere despite William's precautions and operational security. He also acknowledged William's refusal to brief his private secretary afterward, that deliberate maintenance of boundaries between family conversation and institutional knowledge. William responded simply, "Some conversations were between brothers, not institutions, existing in a space that palace machinery shouldn't colonize." The statement hung between them, a gentle but firm assertion of autonomy from the future king to the current one, establishing a principle that would shape William's eventual reign. Charles studied his eldest son with something approaching wonder, seeing perhaps for the first time not just the heir dutifully following prescribed paths, but the man who would reshape the monarchy in ways Charles himself couldn't imagine or implement given his generation and formation. He told William that Diana would be proud of them both for trying, a benediction that carried tremendous weight precisely because Charles rarely invoked his first wife's name in conversations with their sons. The acknowledgement of Diana's perspective, her values, her hope that her sons would always protect each other, represented Charles's blessing on the reconciliation attempt in the most meaningful terms possible. The king's subtle endorsement provided crucial cover for William's unauthorized action. Whatever courtiers might whisper about the meeting in private conversations, whatever concerns they raised about precedent and protocol being violated, Charles's approval neutered their complaints and protected William from institutional consequences. The king might struggle to bridge the gap with Harry himself, might never fully understand his younger son's choices, or forgive the damage done to the monarchy's reputation, but he could ensure William had the space to try reconciliation without institutional interference. In the weeks that followed, perceptive observers noticed subtle shifts in the landscape of royal family dynamics, small changes that accumulated into something more significant. William mentioned Harry's Invictus Games during a veterans event, brief, casual, but present, where previously there had been only conspicuous silence or carefully neutral language that avoided acknowledging Harry at all. Harry, in a podcast interview about mental health and family relationships, spoke about reconciliation in general terms that felt personally significant to anyone paying close attention to the subtext. Nothing dramatic, nothing official, but the temperature had changed, the permafrost of their estrangement beginning its slow thaw. The tabloids naturally erupted with speculation, front pages screaming about secret summits and imminent reunions, and Harry's return to the royal fold being negotiated behind closed doors. All of it was exaggeration built on kernels of truth and fed by the public's insatiable appetite for royal drama, for narratives of conflict and resolution that could be consumed as entertainment. The palace maintained studied silence, refusing to confirm or deny anything, letting speculation run its course without official fuel. This silence was strategic, acknowledging the meeting would invite pressure for details, denying it would be dishonest, and eventually discovered. Better to say nothing and let the story evolve organically. William and Harry watched the media circus from their respective positions, understanding that this was the inevitable price of any movement toward reconciliation. Every gesture would be dissected, every interaction analyzed, every statement parsed for hidden meanings. The reconciliation itself would be dissected, analyzed, weaponized, and monetized by an industry built on their family's dysfunction. They'd discuss this reality during their Frogmore conversation, acknowledging that privacy was impossible but that external interpretation didn't have to determine internal reality. Catherine's cancer treatment continued through autumn, chemotherapy cycles that left her exhausted but gradually showed positive results. William was more emotionally present than he'd been in years, the burden of estrangement from Harry having been lightened considerably, if not eliminated entirely. She'd been right to push him toward that September morning conversation, to extract promises during her illness, to plant seeds that had finally germinated. Some gifts didn't require complete knowledge to be appreciated. She might never know all the details of what transpired at the boathouse, but she could see its effects in William's lightened mood and renewed hope. But William and Harry would remember that morning for the rest of their lives, the quality of light on the Thames gradually strengthening, the feeling of speaking honestly after years of guarded distance and performing roles, the tentative hope that perhaps their story didn't have to end the way so many royal stories had ended before, the recognition that they could write something different if they were willing to take the risk. The palace, stunned by what had occurred beyond its control and knowledge, could only watch as the future they'd managed for so long began slipping toward a shape they hadn't designed or anticipated. The institution that prided itself on controlling every detail, managing every narrative, shaping every outcome according to carefully calculated plans, discovered that sometimes the most important moments happened in the spaces between official events. And those moments, precisely because they existed beyond institutional reach, carried the potential to reshape everything in ways no courtier could predict or prevent. Sometimes the most important royal moments happen beyond cameras and courtiers. William and Harry's secret meeting reminds us that beneath crowns and controversy, there are simply brothers trying to find their way back to each other. Subscribe to witness how this story unfolds.